it's funny. It's like it goes in both directions, right? Like you remember every day what it was like to be young and to think about, to like have playing and learning be your primary job. And so, and in some ways there's something that's like that about being a musician already. Like in order to be a musician, you have to hold on to a part of yourself that is still a kid, you know? So there's like, we could really get to a place where we're like the same, you know? And then it also just, the other side is it's like exhausting, and, you know, the vigilance that you have to have, the like, you know, the relentlessness of it. It's all a lot. And so that the kind of tiredness that comes from that makes me feel old.
He's 4.5 now. So he was what, like 1 when the pandemic started?
Yeah, he was about 7 or 8 months old when the pandemic started.
He will have no memory of it.
Mm-mm.
I can't even imagine in that extremely formative time of, you know, I mean, obviously socialization was an issue. You kind of get used to people wearing masks, but I guess probably the timing was better than a lot of parents I've spoken to who had, you know, kids who were in like elementary school and missed a year of elementary school.
Oh yeah. You know, 100%. In some ways it was, you know, also I had taken a day job, and, you know, in air quotes, a day job as the chief of program at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. And I never wanted a day job, and I'm not doing that day job anymore. But, you know, I do kind of know how to run organizations. So I was doing that for a while, and I started in January of 2020, and then the pandemic happened. So in a lot of ways, it was probably pretty great for my kid, because instead of me being gone every day, all day, I was there, and we had lunch together every day, and he was like on me in meetings, and he has this crazy vocabulary because he would be 1.5 running around saying, you're muted, or I don't have capacity. You know, it was just like these crazy, he would just pick up. So
he's an AI is what you're telling me.
Basically, like, he absorbed so many things that he never would have absorbed, and just like being able to be with me in a different kind of way. So, you know, it was super hard, like it was for everybody. And we all had levels of that depending on what our lives were like and structured like everything. But, you know, for him, I think it was okay. Yeah.
It's hard to tour with a kid. You know, you have to decide, you know, and obviously depends on age, and if they're in school, whether you want to take them out of school, you know, whether you want to leave them with a family member or the parents. But I've talked to so many musicians who have been touring musicians for their kids' entire lives, and it was as hard as the pandemic was for musicians. There was also something wonderful about, like, I mean, effectively being forced to stay home and, like, you know, actually, like, kind of getting to know your child again.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it was always our dream. My partner is a percussionist and, you know, travels with me in the band. And so we've been able to bring our kid on tour, which was always our dream. Like, it's so funny, but I have amazing parents. I love my parents. I would never switch them out for anything. But also, when I was a kid, I was like, I wish I was in a musical family. And so we like really have this dream. Like, we want to take the kid on the road with us. And, you know, so for a while that wasn't possible. And now it is possible. And, you know, he walks into a venue and he'll be like, all right, gets to know the production person and the sound person and the lighting person. And he kind of creates a whole other level of community around it because people start sort of looking out for him. And it's very funny. And then he'll sit on stage and sometimes he talks to the audience and he wants his own drum. He's like, I'm a drummer. He wants his own drum. So we were able to do it and make it happen, you know, just not as early as we thought we would because, you know, we were all home together. But yeah, touring with your kid is no easy feat, but I'm getting there. I'm figuring it out. And also trying to do it as much as possible before he's like in first grade or second grade, or when it gets harder, when that's more serious to miss school and stuff, right? I mean, he's in preschool. Like, it's fine. It's fine if he misses school.
There's, I'm trying to think of things, nap time, a lot of important skills learned in preschool. It's all that socialization thing, though, right? It all comes down to that. Like that, up till a certain point, the main thing that kids get out of school is being around other kids.
Yes, he's definitely very good at being around a lot of adults. He can talk to, yeah. Yes.
I was going to ask if he's musical, but it sounds like he's already started down that road.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's musical. He would get into stuff like, there was the early pandemic, he was really into like Italian folk music. It was like, there's this folk music called Taranta, and it's like, it's super deep. It's like the place where like Italy meets North Africa, where they play frame drums and it's all in 6/8, and it's really amazing music. And he was like super into it. And then he got really into Freddie Mercury, for a while. And he was like, and then he just wanted to listen to like, Bob Marley. There was like a year of only Bob Marley, Anyway, so yes, he's very musical.
Freddie Mercury and Bob Marley make a lot of sense to me. Like that's something that kids would latch on to.
Yeah.
Queen is like very, very like theatrical.
Yes.
And Bob Marley is just this, I don't even know. It's just like, it's like the Beatles, right? It's just like this thing that exists in the ether.
That everybody loves Bob Marley. Who doesn't like Bob Marley? Who? Tell me.
Not your 4-year-old. So you weren't from a musical family.
No.
Not at all. Nobody played anything, or did they listen to music around the house?
Yeah, they did listen to music, and my mother sang to me. She would sing me Ethiopian lullabies and things like that. We were in a kind of push and pull in our household between like old tapes of Ethiopian music and 80s and 90s radio. So it would be like, are we listening to Prince or some Ethio jazz, or is it going to be Michael Jackson today, or like, Walia Band, so it was a lot of push and pull and tug, and but I got all that stuff in my, in that the deep recesses of my mind. So there was a lot of music around. Yeah.
It sounds like you had cool parents. Is that fair to say?
Oh, my parents are great. They're super cool. They're really super smart. My mother, they're both doctors. My mother is the from her year, the only female graduate of the medical school in Addis Ababa. And in fact, there was only one woman who had ever graduated from the school before her. My father came from like a small village, like grew up in literally a one-room gojo, like the traditional, small one-room houses on a farm in rural southern Ethiopia, and became a doctor, like left home at 14. He's like, I mean, my parents are geniuses. They're super dedicated, loving, smart people. They were, they're wonderful parents to have. Yeah.
I was talking to somebody yesterday for the show who is a Japanese Canadian woman, like first generation, and we had the conversation around like, oftentimes, if you're first generation, there's that extra pressure. She said, my family, they're all like lawyers and accountants, and I became an artist. There's that extra pressure because of, the sacrifices they make, and obviously they want you to live the best life you can. And I have to imagine that them moving to the States and them both being doctors, was there some pressure there to go down that route?
Oh, for sure. And we didn't just move to the States. We were refugees. So, we were like years trying to find our footing in the United States. It took a long time. Really, it took like, like 5 to 6 years before my parents were able to redo their training, redo their residencies, and even begin to like, find our footing in that way. So there was a lot of pressure, and actually as an older person, as, like having been a musician for a while now, like I totally get it. It ain't easy. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of feast and famine. It's a lot of, you have to have so many different kinds of skill sets to make it happen. You have to be like relentless in your perseverance towards making music a priority. And, it's like, it's such a privilege to be a musician. So I get it. And I don't resent it in any way. But I also see how they would have wanted me to have an easier path, a path that was more laid out before me. With clarity, where you could like see the steps, it's hard to see it. Like, how are you going to make it? What is it going to look like? Are you going to have stability? How are you going to have all these things, I had to just figure out for myself how to make that happen as a musician. It wasn't laid out before me. But over time, they become my biggest supporters. And, my dad dances on stage at my shows. He'll tell me, he'll be like we had a show in Montreal a few years back. He was like, honey, don't call me on stage. Don't call me on stage. I can't today. I can't. Meanwhile, the first song, he is up there dancing. I was like, I didn't call you. You just came. And he's like, I know. I couldn't help it. Like, he's like that. So yeah, so they've become my greatest supporters.
Was it that thing where it took something, whether it was like a performance or a TV appearance or something like that, in order to really convince them that you were in a good position and that what you were doing was legitimate?
Yeah, I don't know if it was a specific thing. I did become a star in Ethiopia, so there's that. Like, I can't walk down the street without people, like singing my songs to me. So there was that surprise.
That's incredible. Let's talk about that, because this was something I wanted to touch on, because, I was reading up a bit and I saw that. Well, let's start with this. Is it true that it was your TED Talk that really was the breakthrough?
Well, it was two things in 2015. There was the TED Talk, which totally went viral. Like, I mean, it was like it was being shared on WhatsApp. It was being like YouTube. It continues to play on TV, probably without Ted knowing that. I mean, I don't know if Ted knows that, but they take it from YouTube and they put it on TV. And then the same year, I had a music video come out for a traditional song, for an interpretation of a traditional song that I did called Kemekem, I Like Your Afro. And it's like this love song to the person with the perfect afro. And it was really interesting to me because it was both going viral in like activist circles around Black Lives Matter and things like that in the United States, as then it was going viral in Brazil. And then it was also going viral in Ethiopia. And so it was like this kind of Pan-African love fest, of like loving the person with the perfect afro. And so the TED Talk and Kemekem video coming out at the same time really just changed like how people saw me. And after that, my music videos continued to play daily on Ethiopian television. Was
that a conscious decision to put out that song, or to record that song in a way that coincided with the BLM movement?
It wasn't. I mean, okay, so in fact, what happened was I had this kind of musical mentor. His name was Professor Adunya Worku, and he lived in Sonoma, which is not too far from San Francisco. It's just north, like it's like wine country, right? So I would go up there and he would like share traditional songs with me, and he played a bunch of traditional instruments, and he played this song. And I was like, wait a minute, there's a love song for the person with the perfect afro? Wait, I have to do this. I was like, the song just possessed me. And this was 2010, and it took 4 years to record it and then another year to make the video, because things take time, things aren't immediate. But I never let it go. I was like, this has to happen. So then eventually it did. Yeah.
I get that things aren't immediate, but 4 years is a long time to record a song.
But is it? Like the thing is, I had literally, it was coming. I like that. I learned the song at the same time as I was just releasing my first album. So I hadn't even released the first album yet. Then after that, okay, so I released my first solo record in 2010. I had done a solo EP before that. Then I, got a booking agent and started touring, and then I co-founded a project about the music of the Nile River called the Nile Project. And then we were spending like months in East Africa, all over the Nile Basin. We were touring in East Africa, touring in Europe, touring in the US, like looking at the intersection of culture and ecology. Then I made a Ethiopian hip hop space opera with 2 MCs called Copperwire. And then I recorded Come Come. And then I made a music video for it. So it's not like there was nothing going on in between those two things, Yeah.
That's fair. You're throwing a lot at me, and I'm going to circle back around to the Ethiopian space hip-hop opera, obviously.
That was a good one. That was fun.
Getting back to the TED Talk, what's your sense of why that struck such a chord?
Well, so in the talk is called The Unexpected Beauty of Everyday Sounds, and it's about thinking of the world as a musically alive place on its own, and thinking about how we can tap into it when we turn on our listening. And in the talk, I talk about the melody of everyday language, and I talk about this legendary, iconic figure of Ethiopian music called Saint Yared, who was like the mythical originator of the pentatonic scales, but also wrote like many volumes.
A real person.
What I mean by the mythic is like it's like the father of pentatonic music. You know what I mean? Like in a historical sense, he is like, it's like 1500 years ago, but he also wrote many volumes of music that you can still read today. So he was a real historical person and was generating music in this incredible way. And then I also talk about John Cage, and so I think that for me, the magic of it was like this it was about a way of being which is open to the world around you, but also a way that could link like an everyday experience of language to like this like powerful historical figure to a contemporary composer and have them all make sense within one space. And so like there's a lot of ways of talking about traditional music or traditional culture, which is like in amber, where it's like, this is what the tradition is, but that's not what I was saying. I was saying like, we have these incredible, rich historical traditions that make sense in these like experimental contemporary contexts and can live in relation with it. And that's a way of being on a continuum of history, present, and future that lets people be themselves and not feel like, oh, we're backward because, I'm putting that in quotes because we listen to ancient music or our traditions are ancient. No, not at all. You know what I mean? So I think it's a way of being that is like, that breathes a kind of like self-love into the world that is like, leaves a lot of space for people to just be themselves and be future forward in the same space.
It's a hard line to walk. And obviously this is something that you've walked probably throughout your career. I think about it a lot in terms of contemporary American jazz, of walking that line between being reverent for the past, and there are some American jazz artists who are like very reverent to the past to a fault, but jazz is by its nature an experimental kind of music. So it's really easy to just get caught up in the past and just get caught up in the rules. And it's your job. It seems to me it's your job. And I'm saying you, like specifically you as a musician, to navigate those two things.
Well, it's all of our job. Like if any of like and you could apply it to anything. Like, hey, look at the past, draw inspiration from it, whether you're looking at the inspiration of the people who were fighting for rights and justice, or looking at your own ancestors that you're, receiving inspiration from, and take those lessons and make them into a present. Like, what do you do with that to make it relevant to right now? Same ass process, as we were doing with the music. So it's like, it's like we're all on a journey to open our eyes to the way that the past lives in the present moment, but that we don't have to be trapped by it, even as we must look at it with open eyes.
John Cage is interesting because I was reading the Philip Glass memoir that came out a couple years ago. I've been reading that recently. They're both similar in a lot of ways, and it seems like, I think what you're getting at is and this certainly applies to modern art, to painting as well, but this idea of knowing the rules in order to effectively break them.
Yeah, I think that, what I was trying to do was make it universal. I was actually taking it out of music and into like the space where you don't have to be a musician to take those principles and apply them. But in the sense of knowing the rules, it's not rules. It's like, it's about, how do I say it? Like, we have a lot of very individual ways of looking at creativity in this culture. We think about people as geniuses, and they found something, and the genius exists. I'm not trying to deny that.
But this like solitary idea of genius.
But the solitary idea, I like ideas where power to create comes from a continuum where you see yourself in relation to, so it's not just about knowing the rules, it's knowing like you don't just want to learn, like if you listen to Beethoven, right? Like that shit is intense, like if you're going to take the principles of what he was doing and apply them, you better not just take those notes, or the structure. Like he was trying to shake people into feeling. Like you have to take that too. So it's not just the rules, it's also the intention. So you're looking at the ways people did things in a holistic way and then saying, what do I want to do with that to make it relevant and my own now? I had a real moment of lesson with that in 2011. It was the first time I brought my band to Ethiopia, and I met Mulatu Astatke, who is the godfather of Ethiopian jazz. He was the first African to go to Berklee College of Music. He famously had, went to New York after Berklee College of Music and was like immersed in the New York jazz scene at the time. And he was looking at the Cubans and being like, wow, they are beautifully bringing their traditional rhythms and sounds into jazz. And then there was also this famous moment where he met John Coltrane, and Coltrane was like, yo, what happens when you mix this with Ethiopian traditional music? And he went back to Ethiopia and he created Ethiopian jazz. And so the first time I brought my band to Ethiopia, he ended up, the very first show that we did, he was in the front row. I was like, yo, this is Mulatu Astatke. What is he doing here? What is he doing here? Oh my God, he's here, he's here.
Freaked out, understandably so.
And he took me aside afterwards, after the show, and he was like, hey, Ethio jazz is an evolving form. There have only been something like, at that point, like 20 albums that could really be considered Ethiopian jazz. He was like, your job, what is your contribution to this music? He said to me, my contribution was to figure out a way to put 5 over 12. That means the 5 notes of pentatonic scales over the 12 notes of the diatonic scales. He said, that was what I did. What are you going to do? Now you go and take it forward. And like, you could also hear, like, he was probably having that conversation with all his like students and mentees. But he also was telling me, don't put this in a box. Don't play this like we played this 50 years ago. He literally said to me, don't play this like we played this 50 years ago. What is your contribution to the sound? And so that's what it that's what I was, he kind of like tasked me with that. And he also empowered me to both be myself, to bring my own experiences and perspective to Ethiopian jazz, but also to say like, hey, don't let go of what we did, but don't be an imitator. This form needs creative power.
Obviously, he contributed a lot, but it's interesting in his example the example that you gave of him, that he has something like very tangible, right? It's like something you can point to this specific thing. Do you feel that in the 10 plus years since you had that conversation with him that you've kind of figured out what your thing is?
Well, my first response to that album, again, it took years. It was 2011. and then after that, I sort of sat with that conversation for a long time. And it took me working with the Nile Project and tour. I did a bunch of touring with Ethiopian traditional musicians and learned so much from them. And what I really understood was that from that experience, I was like, well, what I really need is a place to start. And the place I'm going to start is Ethiopian rhythms. I'm going to make music that's based in Ethiopian traditional rhythms, because I was like, he's up here on the melody, and I'm going to work with that to some degree, but I'm going to make sure it's all based in the rhythms. And then, so that process was how I made my 2017 album, When the People Move, the Music Moves Too. And it was like a 6-month burst of creativity. I wrote something like 60 songs and chose 11. But then after that, it got more integrated. Like, it got more integrated into, like, that was like an experiment where I didn't know what it was going to sound like. I didn't know. And then now I'm kind of coming from a place with more clarity. So I'm playing more also with melody now. But I do love having the rhythms, because if you have the rhythms, then people will dance. So it will get people up at a concert, so it will act on the body in a certain kind of way.
So your dad gets up and dances whether he wants to or
not. Pretty much.
It sounds like then a big step in that process is getting to a point where those things that you were initially focused on become almost like instinctual or second nature to the work that you're creating.
Yeah, it's like developing a sound, developing a style. Like, it takes, like, people have those albums that are kind of transitional albums where they're figuring it out, and then you see it land, And sometimes the transitional albums are great too. It doesn't mean it's halfway. It's just like, I'm on the 50-year plan. I'm on the, like, that's what I always say. I'm like, I'm going to be a musician, like, and, so over time, probably every album becomes a transitional album, because you're always on the way to growing somewhere. If you're lucky.
Maybe something you're getting at here is the importance of context in terms of almost like where and when and why a piece of art was developed. You mentioned Beethoven, and that made me think of the story of Stravinsky premiering The Rites of Spring, and there was like,
people hated it.
Yeah, there was a riot, and because it was so wild and so different. And now, obviously, like, now it's just like, oh, this is like beautiful classical music that we could put, that they'll play on like Starbucks or whatever. So that there's that energy, there's that. It was these things that were, or like Bob Marley, these things that were like so innovative at the time that are now just this part of universal language. You have to like get back in touch with the conditions under which they were created.
Yes. And to remember their power, and maybe that's why people love Bob Marley, because of that, because what people, there's so many reasons, but what he was pouring into that and what Stravinsky was pouring into that was, it was also so deeply personal too. It was so personal to their place and so personal to their time, and personal to what they were trying to say about the world. Those were statements. Those were very much statements.
Never quite thought of it this way, but it makes a lot of sense. That talk about the because we talk about political music a lot, and there's always that conversation of like, whether political music can make a difference, and maybe a part that people don't address a lot during that conversation is that when you are taking very radical ideas, in the case of Bob Marley, turning them into, like, ultimately they become this, like, part of the fabric of society, and ultimately they're just, like, songs that everybody knows and sings along to, then there's a kind of subversion, and there's like
it's
a
true.
good deal of success in that.
Yes. And just having a place where you can, it's kind of, I mean, there's a lot of it that's about having a place you can return to when you want to feel a certain way. Because, like, life is intense and it's hard. And when you want to feel a kind of, you know, certain sense of, I mean, Bob Marley has it all, right? He has, like, the love songs and everything. But if you want to feel like a sense of power and your ability to fight for something, like, you can go there too. And it's all, somehow it's also just about remembering that it's there for you. You know, it's like, it's there for you when you want that.
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me too that context for you is really important in the sense of these. I mean, we haven't talked about the podcast, you know, we haven't talked about that storytelling yet, but that seems to me that a big part of what that is giving people the context for the art that those artists are creating.
Yeah. You know, I think that, you know, the podcast is called Movement with Meklit Hadero, and we speak to immigrant, migrant, and refugee musicians about their process, their story. It's kind of an intersection of a music discovery show and a show that's about thinking about migration in a different way. What I see is that it's often like a wedge issue or a way to get people fired up to defend something, you know. But I think we should look at it as real people living real lives and contributing incredibly in these cultural ways that are powerful and that give us a space to actually this is my informal tagline is the bump and soundtrack to a radically diverse world. And but yeah, I do think it's about context. It's also about seeing the story that everyone has. And you know, what's really fun is that we get to work with artists who give us the stems, so we get to be really creative about soundtrack and sound design, and really get to look at migration from a cultural place and from a sense of the cultural power that's evolving out of those migration experiences.
It's interesting. So it really is collaborative, even beyond just like the conversations that you're having.
Yes. And we do live shows too. We have a live performance series. And when we do that, it's even more collaborative. So some of the stories on the podcast come from our live performance process, where we're working with artists for 6 months, 8 months, a year. And out of that podcast experience, we develop live stories. Sometimes the live stories are completely different from the recorded podcast, and sometimes they're more like giving a different kind of energy to a story. So, but with the live performance, it's very, very collaborative. We work with the artists, we check in with them. They get to tell us, they get to hear it and be like, okay, did we capture this? What do we need to change? What do we need to add? What did we leave out? And so they're very much collaborating with us. We're not saying, this is what your story is. We do a 2-hour interview and it gets, edited down to 20 minutes. And then we work with them very deeply on making sure we're doing it right. We're telling the story in a way that feels and lands right for the artist. We
talked about the 4 years that it took from deciding you want to cover that song to actually covering it. And then, there's a 6-month or year-long process of collaborating with artists. I mean, it seems to me that, I know this already from all the technical difficulties that we had early on, that you are a very patient person, and that patience plays a big role in the art you make. Well, things take time. It's just how it is, and I'm always doing a lot of things at once. So it's kind of like,
it's like my life is like having 75 tabs open on my browser and just constantly trying to finish whatever it was that I'm doing on any tab, whether that's like thinking about all the dinners that I have to make that week for my kid, to like finishing the EP that's coming out, next spring, to like finishing, almost done with the LP that's coming out next fall, to like, done with season 1, almost done with season 1, got 2 more episodes, season 1 of the podcast, working on the live show that we have coming up in DC in February, redoing our website, working on a new system of accounting for the podcast and the live show. I mean, just like the levels of types of stuff that's happening and has to be moved forward simultaneously to be able to do the different kinds of work that I do, and just the life that I have. It's wild. Like, it's like wild. So yeah, things take time. They take a long time. I'm not an artist who's going to come out with a new album every other year, because I've probably come up with a new cultural project too, and found a way to get it funded. I'm working right now with Stanford University on like, we're going to do a big collaboration bringing together immigrant musicians with the Stanford Policy Lab, to the Stanford Immigration Policy Lab, to think about how musicians can be more involved in, the kinds of advocacy for immigrant communities, that the kind of collaborative advocacy that we think could happen across the cultural sector and advocacy sector. Like, that's going on at this, like, figuring that out is going on at the same time as I'm trying to finish 2 records. So yeah, it's all going to take some time, but then it does happen because from my parents, I got this like relentless perseverance. So I do finish it, but in order to kind of see everything that I'm doing, you can't just look at the music. You also have to look at like the ways that the whole kind of fits together.
Do you worry that something like the music could potentially suffer if you're focused on too many things at the same time?
Yeah, of course. Of course I'm worried. It's like a constant worry. And it probably does. But what I will say is that my goal is to be a whole person. My goal is to use the wholeness of myself and my spirit to do this work. And in order to do that, I cannot ever, ever, ever leave music behind. I know that. But I also, if I'm not an organizer, don't feel satisfied. If I'm not working with a kind of focus and intensity on these cultural projects that are so important to me, I also won't feel satisfied. So it is an internal conflict. It is an absolute internal conflict. And sometimes I feel like, God, I wish my brain was set up simpler, but it's not. So, gotta accept myself and just work with what it actually is.
I suspect you might be like me in the respect that people keep telling me to slow down, and people keep, preaching the importance of like taking some time for yourself and like, and not working all the time. And that's a lesson that I keep having to learn the hard way over and over again. I've gotten a little bit better at it over the years, but do you, because you have so many, in some ways dissonant things going on at any given time, is it hard for you to find those moments of peace?
Well, they're not dissonant. They're just...
Dissonance maybe not the right word.
Here's what they do. They require a different part of me. So, it's like if I'm sitting there writing a gigantic grant that is going to support the organizational work that I do for 3 years, I have a degree in political science from Yale University. I could write. So that's one of the things that I know how to write, but that's a certain side. Like, that's an academic side. I can do that, but don't ask me to stand up and do a concert in the middle of that afternoon. Like, I can't. It's not the same side of me. So I do have to make sure that I'm carving out space what I will say is that, and this relates to a question you asked earlier, when having a kid has made it a little bit easier for me to, like, I used to say to myself, if I'm going to be in the studio, I need weeks. I need weeks to myself just to write. I need the whole stretch of the day. And then I was doing this residency at YBCA, super pregnant. I was like between 5 and 7 months pregnant, and I had to go in the afternoons. And I was like, you know what? I want to write this album, which is actually the album that's about to come out now. So that took years, but also the pandemic definitely stretched that out. But so I was like, you know what? I'm just going to write every morning for 2 hours. I'm going to get in the studio every morning, going to spend 2 hours on the music, and then I will go in and do this residency work that was more like an organizational kind of residency. And I wrote an album. And so I was like, wait a minute, I don't actually, like, I have to stop thinking of it as so precious and start thinking of it as just another part of regular life. And then what helps me switch between the sides is meditation. Like, I need to meditate every day. I do meditate every day. If I don't do that, I don't have the mental flexibility. I don't have the mental flexibility to switch between those states of being. If I meditate, I can do it. So that's how I function.
It took me years and years for meditation to click for me. It was so hard because...
What kind of meditation do you do?
I just sit for 15 minutes, I'll put on like an Alice Coltrane record or something, it's just something like nice and pretty and cosmic, and just sit quietly and try to stop the many thoughts from from overwhelming me. Mm-hmm. I'm an overthinker, and like you, I'm somebody who, like, well, not necessarily like you, but I am somebody who, if I'm not I feel a sense of guilt if I'm not being productive.
Mm-hmm. Familiar.
So it was hard for me to carve out, like 15 or 20 minutes a day to sit, and it was hard for me to be okay with not doing, effectively doing nothing.
And yet it allows you to do so much more. Which is, this is like why everything is opposite, right? By doing nothing for a moment, you can do more. It's just...
The thing that really, the thing for me that's been really great is having, it's kind of like what you were talking about with Bob Marley of knowing what piece of music you can go back to get a certain emotion it's just breathing, because you have that, and you have that like daily practice of knowing what stillness is like. And if you're stressed out and overwhelmed, you can just breathe for a minute and it'll take you back there.
It's very powerful and very important. It's like I know I see these little memes on social media about how they're starting to teach meditation in school and in different schools. And I just feel like, God, it's so important. If I had that as a younger person, I think I would have been, saved a lot of having to figure those kinds of, wellness practices for myself. Yeah.
What did you do with yourself? I mean, obviously having a kid was a big part of it, but what did you do with yourself during the pandemic when all of a sudden, like, a bunch of the projects you had going on just kind of dropped or paused?
Well, so on the one hand, it was like, remember that I had taken a job as the chief of program at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in January of 2020.
There weren't a lot of events for the next couple of years.
Right. So basically we had to figure out, how to be supportive of artists, in particular, a lot of performing artists, but also visual artists and installation folks whose work is very much about space and people gathering. So we had to figure out a slate of programs that we could do virtually that would actually meaningfully support artists. And, we did an artist relief fund. We did a guaranteed income pilot for artists. We did a creative core where we hired a bunch of artists to do public health messaging. We created a giving circle where we actually turned over money to artists, and they figured it out, what they wanted to do with that work and how they wanted to support themselves and their communities through that work. We did like a whole radical program called the YBCA 10, where we invited 10 artists to just take over our spaces for several months. We did this work with a beautiful composer called Samora Pinder-Hughes and pianist it was called the Healing Project, which was about the intersection of music and abolitionist practices, working against the prison industrial complex. And he did 75 interviews. He had done 75 interviews with folks who were incarcerated, and we turned a musical project into an installation and figured out how to do that in the pandemic. So we did all kinds of things while I couldn't be out there performing. And then, 2022 came around, and it started to be a lot more difficult for me, because it was one thing to do that work when there was no performance happening. And then it was another thing to be like, oh my God, they said I could figure it out as a performing artist, but actually I have to make some choices. And so I left YBCA at the end of 2022. That was the right move for me, but also it was the perfect job to have in the pandemic. It was the perfect thing to do in the pandemic for me.
Which again is opposite thing, right? It's ironic that being like an event organizer was a perfect job during the pandemic.
Yes. Yeah, because we could, we figured out virtual. I mean, it was super tough, 6 months into it. I personally had to lay off 7 people. I was like, oh my God, I never wanted to do that. It was horrible. And it was a big learning curve. And I think one of the best, but it taught me a lot that I continue to practice. So project managing my own album release now is it's nothing. Cool, I got this, no problem, because the level of organizing that I'm able to work at now is so much greater. I just learned so much about making not just events happen, but just about how to bring groups of people together for common purpose. And I can use that skill in many ways, in many, many ways.
What can we do, I guess, as a society to prioritize the creation of art?
I think that, first of all, I'm going to start by saying to recognize our history, which is to say that this country has a historical association with utilitarianism, which is the idea of if you can't use it, if it is not useful in a very practical kind of show me the money sort of way, then it doesn't get valued. So I think, okay, understand a little bit about where we're coming from. Well, yes, but also utilitarian, this utilitarianism is a specific kind of thing, but yes, also capitalism. And I think that, first remember yourself as a teenager. And I guarantee you, we all have these moments where music in those years saved our lives, where they made us feel less alone, where it helped us to go on, where it helped us to feel a sense of our own power. We all have those stories. Another thing is you can start to look at the science of it, which I enjoy doing as a person who's the daughter of 2 scientists. You can look at the science of what music is actually doing. So and the way that the umbrella way that I think about it is that it is an ancient technology that we have for bringing people together for a common purpose. And it acts on us physiologically to enable that. What I mean by that is there's all kinds of research about this. There's a wonderful neuroscientist and musician himself called Daniel Levitan, who's done all sorts of research about the ways that the brain waves will entrain with rhythm. That means sync up with rhythm. So if somebody's playing a rhythm, if you're listening to music, if you're at a show, everyone in the audience is syncing up to that rhythm. If you sing together with other people, your heartbeats start to sync up and your breath starts to sync up. And so what you can start to get, your brain releases dopamine, which is the pleasure, which is a pleasure hormone. So neurotransmitter, pleasure neurotransmitter. So you're receiving joy. Your physical body is linking up with people. This is what makes us feel connected to others when we share musical experiences with others, whether we're just in a room sharing an experience, like at a concert, or whether we're singing together with people. Now, what do we have in our world right now? We have epidemics of loneliness. We have epidemics of social fracture. We need music to heal our state of being. We have record levels of depression and, mental health challenges, not just amongst youth, amongst grown-ups, like adults, people. We are living with these challenges and music has the capacity to address them. So if you want to even think of it in this utilitarian way, we need this desperately. We need collective, creative, musical experiences to address the social fractures that we are all living with. Now, what the other side of this is that we can create collective, creative experiences in order to heal. If you want, just bring a group of people together that you love and go to a show. Like you will actually, there's also research about how if you go to a certain amount of shows, you live longer. There are all kinds of experimental programs going on in the UK and in the US called social prescribing, where they are prescribing musical, cultural experiences to people because they are addressing health concerns. So it actually acts on our health and well-being. So we need music. We just need to understand that it's not something extra. It is not something extra. If we would not react in this way physiologically, if this wasn't in us as a species, this is in us as a species. We can't just cut that out. Our deep brains, our deep ancient brains react to music. That means, some people, some neuroscientists think it goes back further than language. That is how long we have been using music to connect people for a common purpose and for health and well-being. So we can't just throw that away. It has got to be integrated into our lives. It has got to be valued, and it has got to be experienced on a regular basis. And if it is, then we actually have something that we can use to heal ourselves in a way that we desperately need right now. So that's my sermon about it.
If you are worried about where I will know who I so who clever and so with my own needs.